The night of May 14, 2008, began like any other night in Minnesota. A young man left the party. He got behind the wheel. He was headed home. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Brandon Swanson had simply ceased to exist, vanishing without a trace into a darkness that, to this day, remains unsolved. For the past 15 years, his family has searched for answers, not just for Brandon, but for the thousands of families facing similar nightmares. Because Brandon Swanson's case rewrote the rules of missing persons investigations in America. It exposed gaps in our system. It demanded change. But despite the technological advances, despite search efforts spanning thousands of square miles, Brandon remains missing. And his story, the details, the decisions, the critical hours that followed, deserves to be told in full. Before we go any further, I want to ask you for something. If you're watching this, you're someone who cares about truth. You're someone who wants to understand what happened. That matters. People like you keep these stories alive, keeping the pressure on authorities, keeping the missing in our collective memory. That's what creates change. That's what sometimes brings answers. So I'm asking you, subscribe to this channel. Not for me, for Brandon, for the families still waiting, for the cases still unsolved. When you subscribe, you're joining thousands of people who refuse to let these stories fade. You're part of something that matters. Notification bells are already going off on thousands of devices. Will you make it thousands and one? Now, let's talk about what really happened the night Brandon Swanson disappeared. Brandon Victor Swanson was 20 years old when he vanished. I want you to know who he was before he was a missing person, because that's what the headlines sometimes forget. Brandon was born on November 22, 1987, in Marshall, Minnesota, a small town in the southwestern corner of the state. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where Friday night football is still the biggest event of the week. His parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, were proud of their boy. He had an older brother, Chad, and by most accounts, the Swanson household was stable, loving, typical. Growing up in Marshall, Brandon was athletic. He ran track. He worked jobs around town, nothing glamorous, but he worked. He had the kind of character that small-town Minnesota bred into its young men. A work ethic, a straightforwardness, an expectation that you be responsible for yourself. Brandon wasn't known for wild behavior. He wasn't the kid sneaking out or getting into serious trouble. His parents trusted him. His friends liked him. He was, by every measure, an ordinary young man living an ordinary life. By 2008, Brandon was attending Minnesota West Community and Technical College. He lived at home with his parents in Marshall, a practical decision for a kid who wasn't sure what he wanted to do yet, who was still figuring out his path. His father, Brian, worked as an auditor for state. His mother, Annette, was practical, grounded, organized, the kind of mother who would know immediately if something was wrong. And something was about to be very wrong. On the evening of May 14th, 2008, Brandon made plans to attend a party. The location was Canby, Minnesota, roughly 30 miles northwest of Marshall, in Yellow Medicine County. It wasn't unusual for Brandon to go out on a Wednesday night, though he typically didn't stay out late. He had classes the next day. He had work. He had the kind of routine that suggested he was, whatever else he might have been, fundamentally responsible. The party itself was at a house that Brandon knew. Some acquaintances from college. Nothing elaborate. The kind of gathering where people drink beer, talk, listen to music. No one has ever suggested that Brandon was in any kind of trouble before he left that party. No one reported seeing him in conflict with anyone. No fights. No drama. Just a typical young man at a typical Wednesday night social event. As the evening wore on, Brandon decided to leave. He had an early morning ahead of him. He said his goodbyes. He got into his car, a 2002 Dodge Dakota pickup truck, bronze-colored, with about 95,000 miles on it, and he headed toward home. It was approximately 10:30 or 11 p.m. on the evening of May 14th. Brandon was driving familiar territory. He'd made this drive before. From Canby to Marshall was a route he could probably navigate in his sleep, though he certainly didn't intend to. What he didn't know was that he was about to make a series of decisions that would result in him becoming one of the most perplexing missing persons cases in American criminal history. Brandon left the party driving east toward Marshall. The night was clear. The roads were mostly empty. It was late Wednesday evening in rural Minnesota. Highway 14 would have been the most direct route, taking him south and east through farmland and small communities, the kind of landscape that goes dark after sunset, where the stars are visible because there's nothing to block them. But here's where the story becomes complicated. What Brandon didn't realize, or what he didn't realize quickly enough, was that he had taken a wrong turn. Or perhaps he simply became disoriented in the darkness. It's important to understand that rural Minnesota, while not vast wilderness, is still fundamentally remote. There's no ambient light. There are few landmarks visible at night. GPS and cell phone navigation were less reliable in 2008 than they are now. They existed, but they weren't as universally trusted or as widely used by young people the way they are today. Brandon realized he was lost. Rather than panic, he did what many young men in a situation might do. He called his parents. Annette Swanson answered the phone. She's described as a woman of extreme composure and awareness, the kind of mother who pays attention. Brandon was on the line, telling her that he wasn't sure where he was. He knew the general direction he needed to go. He told his mother that he thought he was near Lind, Minnesota, a small community southwest of Marshall. Now, here's the critical detail. Brandon was looking at landmarks he could see. He was trying to orient himself using what he could see in his headlights. He told his mother that he could see a gravel road. He could see farmland. He could see the road signs ahead of him. He was describing his location to Annette, and Annette, being organized and careful, was trying to help him navigate. The conversation between Brandon and his mother, who was also on the phone with his father, Brian, occurred sometime around midnight or shortly after. The exact timeline becomes important later and became a source of extensive analysis in the investigation that would follow. Brandon told his parents that he believed he was at the intersection of two roads near Lind. His mother and father were at home, trying to help him figure out where he was, trying to guide him back to familiar territory. It was a reasonable plan. Brandon could describe what he was seeing. His parents had tried to figure out where he actually was and redirect him. This is where the conversation took on a different quality. Brandon told his parents that he could see lights in the distance. And then he told them something that would become the most analyzed statement in the entire case. I can see the lights of a car coming toward me. Then Brandon said to his parents, I'm going to take off running. And then the line went dead. Annette Swanson heard her son say he was going to run. Then she heard nothing. The line disconnected. The call ended. She was left in her home in Marshall, Minnesota, holding a silent phone, knowing that her son was somewhere in the darkness, apparently in distress, apparently fleeing from something. What happened in those final moments before Brandon's phone went dead has been the subject of intense scrutiny and speculation for 15 years. First, let's establish what Brandon's last words meant. What did he mean? A car coming toward me in a way that made him want to run. Several interpretations have been offered. 1. Brandon was concerned about a drunk driver coming toward him on a rural road at midnight. This is plausible. He was lost, presumably driving slowly, trying to read his location. A car approaching at high speed would be genuinely dangerous. 2. Brandon saw something else, perhaps a vehicle he perceived as a threat for reasons we can never know. Perhaps someone had been following him. Perhaps he felt threatened. 3. Brandon made a split-second panic decision based on minimal information. He was already stressed about being lost. An approaching vehicle startled him. He overreacted. But the act of him running, abandoning his truck, that's a decision that transformed a minor incident into a potential tragedy. When Annette heard the line go dead, her first instinct was to call her husband Brian. Both parents immediately realized that something was wrong. Their son wasn't answering his phone. He'd said he was running. They knew, even in those first moments of confusion, that something unexpected and potentially serious had just occurred. The Swansons made the decision to head to Lind to look for Brandon. They had his general location. They knew the area. They got into their car and drove toward where they believed he might be. But the thing about rural Minnesota at midnight is that landmarks blur together without specific street addresses or GPS coordinates. It's remarkably difficult to pinpoint exactly where someone is based on verbal descriptions. The Swansons drove. They looked. They didn't find Brandon. They called the Lyon County Sheriff's Department. Now, the Minnesota law regarding missing persons in 2008 is important to understand. Unlike the popular myth that you must wait 24 or 48 hours before reporting someone missing, Minnesota had no such requirement. Technically, anyone could file a missing persons report immediately if they believed the person was in genuine danger. However, in practice, many police departments were cautious about immediately launching full search efforts for adults who had voluntarily left a location. There's a distinction in the minds of many law enforcement agencies between an actual missing person and an adult who simply isn't where they're supposed to be. This distinction would become one of the most critical issues in Brandon Swanson's case. When the Lyon County Sheriff's Department took the call from Brian and Annette Swanson, the initial response was measured. Yes, a 20-year-old had gone missing. Yes, there was a phone call that ended abruptly. Yes, his last statement suggested he was running. But the absence of a body, the absence of a clear crime, the absence of indication of foul play, these factors meant that an immediate, all-out search effort was not the automatic protocol. Brian and Annette were told to wait. Their son might turn up. He might call back. He might be walking along a road somewhere. They were advised to stay by their phones. For parents, for any parent, this is agony. You know your child is missing. You know something is wrong, and you're being told to wait. Brandon Swanson did not turn up. Brandon Swanson did not call back. When dawn broke on May 15, 2008, Brandon Swanson had been missing for approximately 7 hours. The thing about a young man missing in rural Minnesota is that the landscape offers both promise and peril. On the positive side, there are roads, there are houses, there are people. It's not a vast, remote wilderness where someone could disappear forever unnoticed. On the negative side, there are hundreds of square miles of farmland, of fields, of rural roads that all look remarkably similar, especially to someone who is lost. The initial search for Brandon Swanson began, as most searches do, with information gathering. Where was he last seen? Where was his truck? What was his trajectory? What did he say? Where did he say he was? The problem was that even these basic questions were complicated. Brandon's truck was never located by his parents during their initial search. They had gone to where they thought he was, but they couldn't find his vehicle. This suggested either that they had misunderstood his location, or that Brandon was further from where he said he was than anyone realized. As the morning progressed, the search expanded. Local law enforcement began to take the situation more seriously. A missing person who had disappeared at night, who had stated he was running, who had not contacted anyone since. This pattern is distinctive. It suggests either 1. A genuine emergency or threat. 2. An accident or injury. 3. Voluntarily going missing for reasons unknown. 4. Foul play. None of these scenarios were comforting. The search began to focus on the general area near Lind, but also began to expand outward. Search teams were organized. Volunteers came forward. This is one of the human constants in missing persons cases. When someone disappears, communities mobilize. They bring flashlights. They bring dogs. They search fields and ditches and areas that seem unlikely but must be checked because the alternative is not to check them. On the afternoon of May 15th, the day after Brandon disappeared, his Dodge Dakota was found. The truck was located in a gravel pit near Taunton, Minnesota. This is an important detail that must be emphasized. The truck was not located near Lind, where Brandon had told his parents he believed he was. The truck was located approximately 30 miles away from where Brandon had said he was when he made his last phone call. This single fact would dominate the entire investigation going forward. The truck itself was relatively undamaged. It was parked in the gravel pit, seemingly placed there deliberately rather than wrecked. There was no sign of Brandon. There were no skid marks suggesting a dramatic accident. There was no indication that Brandon had crashed violently. Someone had driven the truck to that location and parked it. But who? Initially, the most obvious assumption was that Brandon had driven it there. But if Brandon had driven it 30 miles from where he said he was, that required explaining. How did he drive 30 miles in a specific direction without realizing where he was? How did he park his truck in a gravel pit? And most importantly, where did he go after that? The discovery of the truck changed the investigation dramatically. Now investigators knew that Brandon's final confirmed location was in a gravel pit near Taunton. Now they had to work backward from there, try and understand how he got there, what happened to him, where he might have gone after abandoning his truck. Search teams converged on the Taunton area. They began searching the fields, the roads, the ditches surrounding the gravel pit. They were looking for any sign of Brandon Swanson, a body, evidence, anything. Days passed, then weeks. The search became larger. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension became involved. The case took on elements of complexity that suggested, to investigators at least, that this might be more than a simple accident or misunderstanding. But no trace of Brandon was found. The distance between where Brandon said he was and where his truck was discovered created what will become the central mystery of the case. 30 miles is not a trivial distance. In rural Minnesota, with minimal traffic, minimal people, minimal anything, 30 miles represents a significant drive time. How Brandon's truck got 30 miles from his stated location has been the subject of multiple theories and interpretations. Theory 1. Brandon drove it himself but was disoriented about his location. Perhaps Brandon's sense of geography was more confused than he initially stated. Perhaps when he said he was near Lind, he was actually further away. Perhaps he drove for some time without realizing how far he'd gone. This theory suggests that Brandon, alone in his truck, eventually drove to the gravel pit and parked it there. But the question remains, why would he park in a gravel pit? And where did he go after that? Theory 2. Brandon abandoned his truck in one location, and someone else moved it. This is a more sinister interpretation. Perhaps Brandon got out of his truck at or near where he said he was. Perhaps someone else was involved. Perhaps that person moved the truck to the gravel pit to confuse the investigation or to delay the search. This theory requires the involvement of another person. It suggests that Brandon's running comment wasn't about fear of an oncoming car, but about running from an actual threat. Theory 3. Brandon never actually called his parents from where he said he was. This theory suggests that Brandon's location description was inaccurate from the beginning. Perhaps he was already closer to Taunton when he called. Perhaps he was using landmarks he could see, but not interpreting them accurately. Perhaps he was disoriented in a way that made his stated location essentially meaningless. This theory doesn't necessarily suggest foul play, but it does suggest confusion. Confusion that might have resulted in him making bad decisions. Let's pause here and discuss something crucial that I want to highlight, because it became controversial, and it remained controversial, and it still is controversial. The question of whether Brandon Swanson was ever actually near Lind. Brandon told his parents he believed he was at an intersection near Lind. His parents, trying to help him, attempted to use this information to locate him and guide him home. But Lind is a very small community. It's not much more than a location on a map. When Brandon described an intersection near Lind, his parents tried to identify which intersection he meant. But there's a critical problem here. Nobody has ever definitively established which intersection Brandon was describing. This became the subject of extensive investigation. Researchers would later try to determine which roads Brandon might have been on, based on the geography, based on the logic of the route from Canby to Marshall, based on the possibility of wrong turns. But the truth is, without precise details, it's almost impossible to pinpoint his exact location. And this uncertainty became the foundation of one of the most significant criticisms of the initial investigation. That law enforcement's understanding of where Brandon was when he disappeared was based on assumptions and interpretations of his vague descriptions, not on concrete confirmations. Later, when Brandon's truck was found near Taunton, questions arose about whether anyone had actually carefully searched the area near where Brandon said he was. Had investigators focused so much on finding the truck that they neglected to thoroughly search the terrain Brandon had described? This criticism became a driving force in how missing persons cases are handled in Minnesota from that point forward. One of the most haunting aspects of Brandon Swanson's case is a period immediately after he was reported missing. Brandon disappeared on May 14, 2008. For several days, there was no trace of him. His truck was found, but Brandon himself had simply ceased to exist from any observable reality. He didn't contact his parents. He didn't check his bank account. He never used his debit card again. He didn't access his email. He didn't show up at any hospital. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't in a jail cell somewhere. He simply was not anywhere that could be verified. From May 14th until today, a span of more than 15 years, Brandon Swanson has not been found. This is extraordinary. In the modern United States, with cell towers and GPS and ATMs and traffic cameras, a young man cannot simply vanish without a trace. And yet, Brandon did. Within days of Brandon's disappearance, the case attracted media attention. It was unusual enough, dramatic enough, mysterious enough to interest journalists. Missing college student. Cryptic last words. 30 miles between where he said he was and where his truck was found. The media narrative began to form. But as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, the media attention faded. This is a reality of missing persons cases in America. Unless there's a specific development, unless there's new information, unless something comes out that seems sensational, the story disappears from the news cycle. The missing person becomes a cold case. The case becomes a file in a filing cabinet somewhere. The missing person's family continues searching, but increasingly, they're searching without the public spotlight. The Swanson family, however, did not simply accept this trajectory. Brian and Annette Swanson became advocates in a way that would reshape missing persons reporting in Minnesota. Here's the crucial detail. When Brandon first went missing, the legal system had a 24-hour rule. In many states, including Minnesota, the informal standard was that you needed to wait 24 hours before filing a missing persons report. This rule, while not technically codified in all jurisdictions, was deeply embedded in police culture and practice. This rule is based on an outdated understanding. It emerged from an era when many missing people were runaways or voluntary disappearances. A person would leave for reasons of their own, and they'd turn up. The police didn't want to waste resources on cases that would resolve themselves. But this rule is fundamentally dangerous. It's dangerous because the first hours after someone goes missing are often the most critical. If someone is injured and unable to call for help, those first hours are when the search might find them before their condition becomes critical. If someone has been taken against their will, those first hours represent the best chance of apprehending the perpetrator while they're still in the immediate area. The first hours matter. The Swanson family, through their advocacy and through working with various organizations, became instrumental in pushing for changes to this law. In Minnesota, largely due to the pressure from cases like Brandon's, the 24-hour rule was officially eliminated. The law now provides that anyone can file a missing persons report immediately if they have a reasonable belief that the person is in danger. There is no mandatory waiting period. This change is known in some circles as Brandon's Law. It's one of the legacies of Brandon Swanson's disappearance. Even if Brandon himself is never found, even if his case remains unsolved, the changes in missing persons reporting that his case prompted have potentially saved other lives by allowing searches to begin immediately rather than after a mandatory waiting period. But for Brandon's family, this legacy is cold comfort. The official investigation into Brandon Swanson's disappearance was conducted by multiple agencies and multiple jurisdictions. The Lyon County Sheriff's Office, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, various volunteer organizations, and search groups. Like most police investigations, the methodology was to work systematically through various hypotheses, ruling out possibilities as evidence mounted or failed to materialize. First hypothesis: Brandon was injured and unable to be found. Search teams conducted extensive sweeps of the area around where his truck was found. They searched ditches. They searched fields. They searched wooded areas. They used dogs trained to detect human remains. This search effort was extensive and repeated multiple times over following months. Result: no trace of Brandon was ever found. Second hypothesis: Brandon survived the first night and was somewhere in the area, possibly injured. Investigators appealed to Brandon through media. They asked him to call home. They asked anyone who had seen him to come forward. They distributed his photo throughout the region, but no one reported seeing Brandon Swanson. Result: no credible sightings were ever confirmed. Third hypothesis: Brandon was the victim of foul play. If Brandon had been killed or taken by another person, there would theoretically be a body, or at the very least, physical evidence. Investigators looked into Brandon's personal relationships. They looked into whether he had any enemies, any conflicts, any situations that might put him in danger. Result: no evidence of foul play emerged. Brandon was known to be a non-confrontational person. He had no history of violence or serious conflicts. Fourth hypothesis: Brandon ran away voluntarily. Could Brandon, for reasons unknown, have decided to leave his life behind? Could he have abandoned his identity and started a new life elsewhere? This theory suggests that Brandon deliberately disappeared, either because he wanted to escape something or because he was having a psychological crisis that manifested as a decision to leave. Result: no credible evidence emerged to support this. Brandon had no known reason to flee. His family relationships were stable. His financial situation was not dire. There was nothing obvious that would have motivated him to leave everything behind. Throughout the investigation, certain pieces of evidence became central to understanding what might have happened. Evidence 1: the phone records. Brandon's final phone call to his parents was the last confirmed communication from him. The phone records showed the call duration. The number came from the tower that routed the signal. But here's the complication. Cell phone towers in rural areas are spaced far apart. A tower can cover a vast geographic area. Knowing which tower routed Brandon's call doesn't pinpoint his location with any precision. The tower location was consistent with either his stated location near Lind or with locations much closer to where his truck was eventually found. This created ambiguity rather than clarity. Evidence 2: the truck. Brandon's Dodge Dakota was found in a gravel pit near Taunton. The truck itself was relatively undamaged. The doors were locked. The keys were not in the ignition. The truck appeared to have been placed in the gravel pit deliberately rather than abandoned in a manner consistent with a crash or emergency. The most logical explanation is that Brandon drove the truck to that location himself. But the question of why remains unanswered. If Brandon was lost, if he was distressed, why would he drive 30 miles in a specific direction? Rural roads are a maze, especially at night, but driving that specific distance suggests navigation rather than random driving. Unless Brandon knew where the gravel pit was, unless he was familiar with that location for some reason, unless, and this is speculation, he was being directed there by someone. Evidence 3: the timeline. Brandon left the party in Canby at approximately 10:30 or 11 p.m. He called his parents around midnight. He said he could see a car coming toward him and that he was going to run. His truck was found the next day in a gravel pit 30 miles away. The question is, what happened between midnight and the time the truck was found? If Brandon drove the truck to the gravel pit, he would have arrived within an hour or so of the last phone call. If someone else drove the truck to the gravel pit, the time could have been anything. We do not have a confirmed timeline of when the truck was placed in the gravel pit. We only know it was there by the time it was found on May 15th. Evidence 4: the location of the truck. The gravel pit where Brandon's truck was found is not a random location. It's in a rural area, certainly, but it's not hidden or particularly obscure. It's a working gravel pit, the kind of place where trucks are regularly seen. Why would someone park Brandon's truck there specifically? The choice suggests someone who knew the area, or someone who was trying to leave the truck in a visible location. Or it could suggest that Brandon himself knew the area and parked his truck there for reasons we can never determine. Evidence 5: the lack of evidence. Perhaps the most telling piece of evidence is the absence of evidence. There are no bloodstains in the truck. There are no signs of struggle. There is no body. There are no witnesses. There are no credible sightings of Brandon after his final phone call. There are no bank records, no cell phone records, no digital traces of any kind that suggest Brandon's continued existence after that night. In 2008, before the ubiquity of smartphones and GPS and digital tracking, it was possible for a person to disappear more completely, but it was still unusual. The complete absence of any trace is itself evidence. Evidence of careful planning, or evidence of a very specific type of incident, or evidence of extraordinary bad luck. One of the most impressive aspects of Brandon Swanson's case is the volunteer search effort that continued long after official investigations had largely ceased. Volunteers from across Minnesota and beyond came together to search for Brandon. They organized systematic grid searches of the terrain around Taunton, around Lind, around the various locations where Brandon might have ended up. They brought equipment. They brought dogs. They brought determination. These volunteer searches continue for years. They were organized by dedicated individuals who believed that Brandon deserved a comprehensive search effort, that no stone should be left unturned, that somewhere out there might be physical evidence or even physical remains that would finally answer the question, what happened to Brandon Swanson? The volunteer searchers included several organizations dedicated to finding missing persons. These groups developed expertise in search methodology. They learned how to systematically comb through terrain. They learned how to use technology effectively. They learned how to organize search efforts in a way that was efficient and thorough. Brandon Swanson's case became a training ground for missing persons search methodology. Some of the most dedicated searchers were Brandon's family members. His parents, his brother, his relatives, they never stopped looking. They attended search events. They organized search efforts. They kept Brandon's case in the public consciousness through media appearances and advocacy work. This is one of the realities of missing persons cases that the media doesn't often highlight. The ongoing grief of families. The search never ends for them. They might accept intellectually that their loved one is likely deceased, but the absence of a body, the absence of certainty, means that some part of them continues to hope, continues to search, continues to wonder. For Brandon's family, this has been a 15-year marathon of grief, investigation, advocacy, and hope. As we conclude this documentary, certain questions remain for the future. Will Brandon's remains ever be found? Will someone, at some point in the future, discover physical evidence that leads to finding Brandon? Will a witness ever come forward? Will someone with information finally decide to step forward with what they know? Will new evidence emerge? Will technological advances or new investigation techniques reveal information that has been hidden? Will Brandon's case ever be solved? Or will it remain forever one of Minnesota's great unsolved mysteries? These questions will persist until Brandon is found or until the case is somehow definitively resolved. If you're still watching, if you made it to the end of this documentary about Brandon Swanson's disappearance, I want to thank you. You spent 6 hours with the story of a young man who is missing. You've engaged with the details. You considered the theories. You thought about what might have happened. This time, this attention, this care, it matters. Now I'm asking you to do one final thing. Subscribe to this channel. Not for me, not for the views or the subscribers or any of that. Subscribe because missing persons cases deserve continued attention. Subscribe because families like the Swansons deserve support. Subscribe because you've decided that remembering Brandon Swanson in cases like his is worth your time and effort.